Again. So let us now move to discuss that in more detail, and I'm going to invite our panelists up, and please do come and join me as I introduce you. Maria João Rodrigues, MEP, who is the S&D Group Vice President in charge of economic and social policies and its rapporteur on the annual growth survey for the whole Parliament. And of course, many of you will know, come and sit next to me, Maria. You come and sit. Many of you will know Maria João, it was mentioned earlier, as the mother of Lisbon, we call her, because of her role in the Lisbon agenda. Marcus saying this morning, we already had the recipe there. We knew what we needed to do. I'll have a question for you later on, why so long on we aren't getting there. Hans de Boer, President of the Confederation of Netherlands Industry and Employers, VNO-NCW. A very warm welcome. I probably should have known how to do those letters in Dutch, but it might have stretched my linguistic talents a little too far. Diogo da Silveira, CEO of the Navigator company, a print, production, forestry products company with a new name, I think, as of last week, Diogo. Very warm welcome to you. And last but not least, Danny McCoy, CEO of the Irish Business and Employers Confederation, Ibec. Very warm welcome to you too. So, as before, you know the drill. We're diving straight in. I have some questions for them, and then I'll come out to all of you. And I really do want to focus now very much, drawing on what the Prime Minister was talking about. And the Prime Minister said, we will achieve our goals step by step. Tell us what to do, in essence. And you too made that point about step by step. Where for you, when we talk about being big on the big things, and I'll start with you, Maria João, what for you are the biggest of the big things? Where can Europe really deliver? Emphasis put by this Commission will only work in the areas where we think we can deliver. What are these challenges, the most important challenges from your perspective?
Well, I must say that after a conference like that, in the morning, to be challenged with this idea of big things, being about big things, well, for me, this is something really appealing, not easy, I must say. But I'm here with the experience of European policymaker, mainly. So starting with the Council of Ministers, then the European Council, then the European Commission, and now Parliament. And for me, this is great to have this opportunity of dialogue again with the business community. And I would say three things. First thing, we need a new global strategic concept for Europe, which means that Europe should be able to lead by quality, because we are not a big continent. We are confronted with much bigger continents. But we can lead by quality. And this means to have an advanced concept of competitiveness, which should be based on sustainable development, but also making the best of this energy transition and digital revolution. This is my first point. This should be translated in a very active economic diplomacy. That's why it's so important that High Representative Federica Mogherini referred to this yesterday. And like that, we should develop our strategic partnerships, be it TTIP, be it the strategic partnership with China, among many other examples, exacting by leading these kind of competitive, which is an advanced one. This is the first idea. But there is a second, which is to make the best of our internal market. And I believe, of course, we have different priorities, but when we focus on digital revolution, this time, this is a different kind of revolution. Because, as many of you have underlined, this is not only about telecommunication, this is about all objects and services surrounding our life. All objects will become smart objects and connected objects. So, ultimately, this is about the relationship between digital revolution on one hand and our way of life. And that's why Europe can lead. Because Europe remains the continent where the way of life is the most sophisticated one, the most advanced one. So we can lead, but this means a lot of innovation by European companies. A good example is the concept of smart, clean, and inclusive cities. We need to transform the way our cities work, our way of life in cities. Like that, we can mobilize all kinds of technologies and all kinds of investments. And my last big proposal for big idea is Europe should reorganize its relationship with the neighborhood. So we have now the crisis knocking the doors in our borders. We need, in fact, to address the source of the problem, which is investing and developing the neighborhood. But I also believe that we need to build up a real European border. And this is a smart infrastructure which should be built. Otherwise, the risk is there that member states will go back to national borders and we lose Schengen. Okay. So my last appeal for the business community, in moments like that, we need to have business community very active, bringing about real European solutions.
Okay, thank you very much. A very clear manifesto there, agenda for how we deliver in those key areas. Lots to come back to later on. But Hans, can I ask you, and from a business perspective, and you were listening to your Prime Minister speaking there, where do you think Europe needs to be really big? Are they focusing on the right priorities now? And where do you think they need to be very small indeed? Because there's two sides to this coin, big on the big things, small on the small. Where do you think Europe really can deliver and should be big, and where shouldn't it?
Well, I think Europe should be big as a world power, as a global world power, acting as a balancing factor between China, the US, and maybe Russia. So that would be my longer-term objective, because that would help us live in prosperity and peace. To do that, I heard Emma say this morning, there are two kinds of countries in Europe, the small ones and the ones who think that they are big but will be small in a very short time. And I agree completely with that. So I think that should be the long-term goal for Europe, and that's my motivation, to be a European. But in the long term, as Keynes has said, we are all dead, so we need to solve problems in the short term. And then I agree completely with my neighbor, Maria Rodrigues, and I would like to float an idea here, not only on behalf of the Dutch Business Association, but also on behalf of a few of my colleagues with whom we have spoken and with whom we have touched on more or less the same idea that Maria just discussed. In the Netherlands, we have done some calculations, some rough calculations, and we have calculated that if you would build an intelligent system, border system, not a wall like Mr. Trump says, but an intelligent, data-driven, high-tech border system, which would also encompass, let's say, high-quality refugee camps outside of that border. That might be a project which would cost, on a yearly basis, around 50 billion euros, a rough estimate. And that would be less than 0.5% of the European GDP. Now, if we could organize a project like that, if our European and national governments would work together in that, they could do a lot of good in a lot of areas. Because then we would come up with an effective and humanitarian right way of solving the crisis that we have now. We would have a project which would be liked and endorsed by the European population. And I think the project of Europe needs that. It needs support by its citizens. And this could be that project. And when we would make a project out of it and say, okay, we are doing this with support and the input of the European business community, their high-tech capabilities, then this project could be something like, let's say, the Man on the Moon project by Kennedy. And it could do a lot of good for growth, and development in the European area and support for the European idea. So that would be my...
Thank you. Very interesting, because we often talk about, do we need a new initiative like when the single market was launched, the 1992 initiative, and people said, the energy union is it. We now have a new one, possibly, that could address... We've talked about public opinion a lot today. It's come up in every discussion. So, as you're saying, could tick all that boxes. Diogo, from your point of view, is the Commission now being big on the right big things? Or would you have another one or a different emphasis? And where do you want it to be very small indeed?
When we do listen, everyone seems to agree. Everyone seems to agree on what we have to do. When we, as a basic business person, when I do check on the ground, it's not happening. So I would say that what we need is a different equilibrium, a different balance. And let me share that along 3 dimensions. A new balance between, in the single market, and I also prefer single to internal. Commissioner is not here anymore, but I also prefer single to internal. We have to find the right balance between one size fits all and being customized. Example, when there is a special process for approval of investments above 25 million euros, for most European countries, that is okay. For small countries, that is not okay, because projects of 25 million euros, you don't have much. When you are on top a country that is in a periphery, like Portugal, for issues like electricity, just from a geographical perspective, if things are not opened up between France and Spain, there's no way. So a new balance between being one size fits all, of course, but some customization is required. We were expecting this. It didn't happen yet. Second balance between doing the right things and the things right. And something that was already mentioned here before, and we know well from our sector, we have to find a better balance between 2 of the key pillars for sustainability: economic and environmental. In many sectors, the legislation is such in Europe that for environmental issues you cannot do the investment, but of course you will do the investment somewhere else in the world, and the jobs are created somewhere else in the world. The latest, we are the European market leader of office paper. It's not so common that a small Portuguese company is a European market leader. But the last 2 investments we are making are in the US and in Mozambique, Africa. Third balance, I'll leave the third balance for the next topic.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to ask you later, if you've made those decisions on investments and to go elsewhere, why? But we'll come back to that in a moment. I want to just complete the picture of what we regard as the big things and what should be the small things. Danny, would you agree with the emphasis that the others have placed? Would you highlight something else?
Certainly would agree with what the others have said. I think they have big ideas there. I might talk about process a little bit more, and particularly picking up on the Juncker plan, which I think has the seed of something significant, which is the bringing together of private savings and public infrastructural needs. And I don't think that in the last decade Europe has been good at matching those things together, because clearly one of the great indictments of our generation is the lack of investment that has gone in right throughout Europe, and there's no sign of that being addressed right now. So I'd focus on the big thing is around the scale of investment. And why is it that we are experiencing a dysfunctionality in what is a rich economy with people who cooperate with each other and genuinely want to cooperate with each other? What's going wrong? I think we're distracted, tragic as it is, by the migration crisis, to the risk of not observing that our monetary policy transmission mechanism may be fundamentally broken. Our central banks and the transmission of savings to investment by observation is clearly broken. And so one of the big things that Europe should do in the Juncker Commission, and seem to be moving that direction, was to try to bring the public and private together. On the small things, I agree on that very last point. It is always nice to say the one size fits all. But one of the lessons from the crisis years was when the going gets tough, Europe has a capacity to splinter into differential treatment. That is just an observable fact. So to continue this notion that we have a one size fits all is demonstrably not the case and evident in many, many different areas. So let's embrace that. And I think that's one of the things coming more recently from the British question, is that we've got different destinies within a multi-equilibrium Europe now, not a singularity to which we've pretended for too long to be all travelling to, others travelling at different speeds. And so the last point about that is be small on the small things, and I would describe those as lifestyle things. Different people in different areas have different lifestyles. Too far a reach into things like working time, and not accepting that work-life balance comes in different ways now transmitted by the revolution of digitalization and the internet. Europe needs to get out of that lifestyle and out of those working time issues, and I think that's...
So coming back on this point Diogo made about the balance between the customised and the one-suits-all, question though, where that balance will lie, because one man's interfering with your work-life balance is another man's damaging the level playing field in a competitive single market. So it's not an easy dilemma.
It's certainly not an easy, and I think if I get the mood from the room, and certainly from the Irish perspective, we really want Britain to stay within a reformed EU. But once that deal goes through now, it is cementing the notion that we have different outcomes.
So we're going to have to learn to live with it. Yeah.
And so we've crossed that Rubicon.
Just one question to link us right back to this morning's discussion. And you talked about a dysfunctionality. Because you said we want to work together, and yet it is, at the moment, we are struggling to do so. I just want to ask you all, unless we find responses, and you've all mentioned the migration crisis, the threat to Schengen has come up a number of times today, and so on. If we don't find answers to those things and keep together, will we be able to be big on the big things? What is the glue that right now, Maria João, in the face of where we are, and a big, big threat to our unity over the migration and refugee crisis, what is the glue that can bind us back together? Because presumably without that, we can't reform to perform or be big on anything.
No, I think we have a big paradox, because on one hand, we can see clearly the potential of Europe, of Europeans. This is very clear. On the other hand, now we are confronted with these overlapping crises. And for most of these crises, the only solutions which can work are the so-called real European solutions. It is very clear when it comes to the refugees crisis, because if we just address this crisis with national reactions, this will destroy Schengen, clearly. So the only solution to address this crisis is to build a real European border. So I completely endorse the concept described more in detail by my colleague. This is one example. Another example, which was not mentioned all over the conference, but it is there, is the so-called Eurozone crisis, because this crisis is still there. We still have very relevant divergences between member states. The Eurozone is still producing divergences rather than convergence. And I believe that in order to produce, again, convergence, we need, first of all, to make sure that one SME is investing in one country, it can get some similar credit conditions to another SME investing in another country, which is not the case. So this means that we should complete the so-called banking union. This is also a big thing which should come. And finally, our way to play our role at world level. Europe should be equipped with a real economic diplomacy. We still don't have it, but we can make a lot with this. because the assets of Europe, when we deal with our global partners, are huge.
Just before I come to you, Hans, on this question of economic and monetary union and the governance thereof, another thing Business Europe has emphasised very much, and we talked a lot today about implementation. We heard this figure this morning, country-specific recommendations in the context of the gloriously named European semester. I do hate that phrase, but only 1 in 5 recommendations being implemented. Are we being ambitious enough? You mentioned the banking union, but in other areas to really deliver an EMU that works? Briefly, if you would.
Well,
and then
I would say that these so-called European the problem is that when recommendations are tailor-made for each country, then they are not implemented. We have a real deficit of implementation. What is the solution for this? From my viewpoint, this is about involving the national bodies, so the national parliaments, but most of all, civil society, and starting with business community. So far, the involvement of business community is also not enough. When member states are preparing the so-called national reform programs, this remains a very technocratic exercise. This should be rather an agenda for civil society.
Okay. So as we were talking earlier about bringing the business community more when we're developing trade policy, bring them in here. Hans, from your perspective and the possible, this dysfunctionality and how serious it could be.
Jackie, I oppose very much the idea of pessimism on Europe. We did a survey in the Netherlands and asked the Dutch citizens, who are of course very sensible people, as you know, and asked them about their support for structural aspects of Europe, which means having a single currency, having the euro, have free traveling around in Europe, go on holiday, whole family in the car, drive to Spain and have a nice 2 weeks. Or Portugal, for that matter.
Thank you, Diogo.
And it appeared that 2/3 to 75% of the Dutch citizens are very much in favor of Europe, of these fundamentals of Europe. They like it to be European. So I'm optimistic on that one. And I think we should also be positive on it when we discuss this. They are negative not on Europe, but on Brussels. They say, what are they doing there? It's so technocratic. It's bureaucratic, they say. Maybe they don't have the right feeling, but that's how they perceive it. And now I come up again with my idea. Peter Drucker once said, real commitment is in the execution. And I think what Europeans want now is they want to see the power of the EU institutions to solve the problem of immigration. So it's not a danger or a problem, no, it's a challenge for Europe to show what it's worth. And I'm most happy with your support for the idea of a few colleagues, presidents of business federations and myself. Most happy with your support. We say, okay, if we could do something like this, it would be a big project, but it's only 0.5% of our national income on a year basis. And what could it do with our economy? And on the other side of the medal, if we don't do it and Europe fails, what would that do to the economy and how much would that cost? So what I think what should happen is we should reason less technically and less politically, and Europe should come up with solutions that the people really want.
And that's true because we heard this morning, and I think it was Ulrich Grillo said in the very first panel, people need to see Europe as part of the solution. And increasingly, not when you ask them about the things you ask them, but more broadly, businesses, small businesses, not big business generally speaking, but see it as part of the problem, not part of the solution. Diogo, for you, what is the solution? And I am minded here, though. Governments are quite technical and bureaucratic when it comes to a certain point in the legislative process, but people don't see national governments in the same way. To get the rules right for industry and so on, it does have to be, to an extent, technocratic, doesn't it? Particularly when we're talking about legislation to govern new technologies and so on. I mean, how do we square that circle?
I'll try to share a view. Let me first just come back to a question you did put earlier on the glue that
Yes.
would keep Europe.
Keep us
Because,
together.
I mean, as in general, as businesses, and we, the company I lead and the Portuguese Association, we just want more Europe. So just to make sure, the glue, I think, is very much basic. We should not forget Europe is a peace project. If that's not enough a glue, what else do we need? So that should be a glue for us, for our children, for our grandchildren. Peace project. At the same time, we have to be very much pragmatic. That's what we don't see happening. And linking this to your question, yes, in the local governments, they tend to listen to businesses, let's say, and to, but at European level, we don't feel that enough. We don't feel we are enough heard. We are asked to contribute, we are asked to join, we are asked, but we don't feel we are enough heard. And we are, you know, we're just managers. We don't have big ideas, but we're pretty good at doing things. So if we would be heard a bit more, things would be more pragmatic, more actions. Let me just share with you one very specific example, just to show a different pragmatic approach oriented to the objective, and that shows that there is not enough Europe. We had an anti-dumping case in the US. Anti-dumping is just to compare the price at which you sell a good in the destination market, in this case the US, versus the price at which you sell it in your home market. So it's not related to cost. And we said our home market is Europe, because we've been in Germany, for instance, for 25 years, and we sell most of what we sell in Europe. The US knew they had no case if the home market would be Europe. So they said, no, your home market is Portugal. Unfortunately, I talked to quite some people in Brussels, and they couldn't help me out. So I got the tax 7.8%.
But that is because Europe doesn't make its power felt in the US. And that's the same matter as we discussed this morning on the steel dumping from China. When you act as a big power, as a balancing global power, you should also be powerful in these matters. Sure. And you should support your businesses. You should do that.
Danny, you mentioned this dysfunctionality, and we've heard some ideas here. This idea of a big project that would address the biggest challenge we face, and the one that is causing uppermost in the public's minds at the moment, but also might be a symbol that Europe is part of the solution, not part of the problem. Do you think that answers, and just in relation to economic and monetary union and the institutional structures there, do you think Business Europe has called for a clear path and said we need to be more ambitious and it's urgent to really complete it? Do you think we are on the right path, and how important is that to restore business confidence and therefore the investment climate?
Well, ironically, business confidence is very high relative to what the narrative is about Europe. So if Europe determined business confidence, then business confidence should be really low now. We don't see that. Businesses are confident because the world is getting bigger, people are getting richer in Africa, in the BRIC countries who are having a growth recession, not having a recession per se, they're having the big ambitions we had. So business is confident despite the narrative around Europe. But I go back to my original one, is the big plan that the Juncker Commission, I think, should be lauded for, but we're not behind it enough, is to set forth what is the scale of investment per year Europe needs to go for. We believe it's 4% of GDP for the Irish economy and for a lot of the economies, because it's not just normal, we're trying to catch up. And in that regard, the scale of the Juncker plan is clearly minuscule to start with, but it's a good idea, and how do we scale it? But the very first thing you'll come up against as a member state is you will fall foul of the fiscal rules. As you move from the preventive arm into the corrective arm, or vice versa, corrective into preventive, we have a scenario in Ireland where a government effectively, which is supposed to be the poster child of the anti-austerity, has fallen foul with the electorate because they couldn't tangibly show them the recovery in identifiable investments, because they were hitting a fiscal rule which has become the primary rule, as opposed to the growth rule, which will get us out of this impasse.
Can I just ask what you meant there when you said, okay, you said it's minuscule, it's not enough, but you said, and we're not getting behind it enough. There will be a reason for that, because the Commission has very much relied on its leveraging capacity of a small amount of money, public money, to leverage an enormous amount of private investment. If it's not happening to the extent that it needs to, why not? What will make the difference? A thought from you all, and then I'll come to you on the Juncker plan, and then out to all of you. Why isn't it happening, Danny?
First of all, I would consider myself to read quite a lot of current affairs, Financial Times, the Economist. A year ago, I would have seen the Juncker plan popping up quite a lot as just in a sentence. I don't know when the last time I read, outside of a Commission documentation, the words Juncker plan. And so if we're not reading it when we're looking for it, citizens have no idea what's going on.
Now, poor Mr. Katainen, Vice President Katainen, is on his road show, but you think it's quite a lonely plough he is furrowing.
And we met him in Dublin. But it hasn't translated into a more broader, sophisticated business audience.
Diogo, why is it not capturing the private sector?
I'll start with the positive. At least now we see more willingness, okay, to do something, and there is a plan and this idea of big on the big things. We see willingness, but it's not happening. So if this would be a company, we would just look at the process, understand what is missing, and correct it. For sure, the process is not happening because there is willingness now. We feel there is a vision. It's not happening. So something is missing somewhere at some step.
I thought the Netherlands were the only country where the Juncker plan was not a big success.
Okay, but of course also there are two elements, Maria João, to the Juncker plan, which is not just the money, but the reforms that go with it, creating the investment climate. How do you think he's doing? They're being quite tough on it. Are they right?
Well, by coincidence, I just could adopt in the Parliament the report for this year economics policy. And our main conclusions, endorsed by the Parliament as a whole, are first to recognize that there is indeed a big investment gap we need to address. Otherwise, Europe will lose ground in this green transition, the digital revolution, and so on. This means, first of all, to energize credit provision, because there is also a problem. It's not lack of savings, because we have a lot of savings in Europe. It's how to turn savings into real credit for companies, particularly for SMEs. So this is not working well. That's why we need to complete banking union and to develop this capital markets union. So this is one part of the solution. The other one is to have a better combination with public investment. And that's why we have introduced this margin and flexibility in the Stability and Growth Pact. But this should be really used. And then there is the third part, which is the demand problem. Because I've not seen this problem addressed today, but the situation we have, even in the long trend, of course, this is positive, but the global outlook for this year is not brilliant. Everybody knows this. So most of the BRICS are confronted with real problems. The average growth rate, which is foreseen for the global economy, it's much lower than in previous years. So this means that, of course, Europe needs to pursue this big export effort, but we also need to have a second look to domestic demand in Europe. All our G20 partners are advising strongly Europe to also to foster domestic demand. Yeah? And when we come to this point, now I'm reaching a tricky issue, but we discussed this in the Parliament and we reach a good compromise, is we should start by asking member states with higher surplus, of course they need to go on exporting, but they should also expand somewhat their internal demand. This can help them, first of all, but can also help the European economy as a whole. This is another part. Finally, reforms. We had a very good discussion on what should be the reform agenda for the years to come in the European Union. And our conclusion is that we need to develop and implement on the ground a kind of second-generation reform agenda, where we do address labor market policies and pension reforms, but also reforms of the education system, innovation system, good public administration supporting businesses and citizens. So these are the kind of reforms we also need to implement.
So very much echoing what has been said. Hans, you want a quick one before I go out into the room?
Yeah, well, you could see the economy as a small piece of rope, and you can either push it or you can pull it. And that has to do with demand and demand factors. Then you pull it and push it when you reform and everything. Both are important. But I think we are in a moment of time where credit is very cheap, where there is necessity for, let's say, some big infrastructural projects, among which could be our intelligent border project. And I think we're in a moment of time that more pull factors have to be brought into the game. 2 weeks ago, economists saying we are out of ammo. All the measures that you can put, we are out of ammo. But I think we should come up with these kind of things and should find an intelligent way in how to finance these sort of demand pull type of measures.
Any comments to that before I go out, Danny?
I'll just take one issue. I don't believe that the cost of capital for small and medium enterprises is cheap, because when you have a market growing at 1%. And the cost of capital for SMEs is well in advance of that. Those aren't right conditions. The wholesale costs of interest and for large firms to get their hands on it, but the transmission mechanism is dysfunctional for SMEs.
And will the Capital Markets Union address that for you? Are we on the right track? We just now need to deliver, or?
Certainly on the right track, but one can't see that happening in a time frame that's meaningful for a lot of the SMEs who will still, as the Prime Minister said, be attractive first to the United States and further shores to actually go after the markets and the capital.
Diogo, did you want to add anything there?
Well, just a fact. I think the same SME in Ireland and Portugal versus Germany will pay double the interest rate. The very same company. That's all.
Okay, we go back to your point from earlier. Last chance today, ladies and gentlemen, for questions or indeed comments. And please introduce yourself, Simon Wilson. Godwin, sorry.
Thank you, Jackie. Simon Godwin, Impact Assessment Institute. If you want to be big on the big things, you have to know what is big and what isn't. So how do you determine what's big? There's a subsidiarity check in legislation. There's a proportionality check in legislation. Should there be a bigness check or a substantiality check? And what should the metric be? Should it just be a financial metric, or should it be more qualitative? If you take a couple of examples, circular economy, everybody would agree that that's big piece of legislation, but it's made up of much smaller parts. Are each of those smaller parts big enough themselves? Look at it from another point of view. The most notorious small thing is the olive oil bottles, if you remember that piece of secondary legislation. But that is part of consumer protection, which is in itself a very big thing. So do you get rid of all of consumer protection using that thinking? So the question is, how do you measure what's big? Who decides what's big? And how are those decisions scrutinized?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And that olive oil reference, of course, to the plan that there was to ban having it in little dishes on restaurant tables. Other comments or questions? Hang on just a second. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Albert Waller. Speaker asked also a content point of view. The Commissioner also mentioned the circular. One of the things where Europe can be big on. So I welcome the visions from the panel on how Europe can be big on the circular economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Any others before we come back? Okay, how do you define? I think each of you had your own definition of what the big thing is or what the big thing should be. But do we need some sort of more systematic way of saying, you know, it's not just the 10 things that this commission plucked out, but there needs to be a rationale behind it? Or does it work? The focus that we had earlier was actually quite simple. It's big if we can deliver on it. Is that the right benchmark? So can Europe actually make a difference, add value in this area? Would that be the way you measure bigness? Any thoughts? Danny?
I think it's a very good question about what's the scale of we're talking about here, and the only metric really that we have is financial. And so while the Juncker plan is a big idea, and definitely a big idea, of trying to trap in the very heavy predominance of private wealth that exists in Europe now, the problem is the scale of the plan is insignificant for even the private sector to engage with it, because my numbers may be wrong, but fundamentally its root money is about 17 billion that by alchemy magics up to 60 and then in turn up to 300 billion. It's minuscule. And I think the problem fundamentally lies is that the amount of resources we give as member states to the core is insufficient to run a global economy. That our problem is fundamentally that we're unwilling to provide any more core funding into the centre, and yet we think, going back to our colleague on the 3D printers earlier on, it's a function writ large that we managed to scale down into 28 when we should be aiming for one big.
Thank
so
you.
Financially, big idea, not enough money, not enough ambition in it.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
I'd like to come because when we speak about big things, I think it's important to come with images of physical things to make our imagination work. Let me give an example, not about Europe, but about China. So everybody knows that the strategic thinking in China is not changing because they are reaching a certain limit of export-driven growth. They also explore their internal markets. But even that, this is also limited. And that's why now they are coming a third idea, a big thing for China, which is to come back to the idea of the Silk Road. And they call it the One Belt, One Road project. And this is indeed a big thing, because the idea, as you know, is to connect China with Europe via continental road, but also by sea. So it's really a big thing. So if we take this example, and we ask, what could be big things for Europe to make our historical imagination to work again? And I can see three things, three physical things. One is another way to put Europe in the global map, adding to our global chains, and this is a very active economic diplomacy. This is one thing. And this is physical. This is a powerful network of influence in the global game. This is one thing. Second thing, this idea of the smart border. Reorganizing our relationship with our neighborhood in such a way it can become a win-win relationship, a positive relationship. See, a big thing, this is physical. And third physical idea is to transform our cities, where most of Europeans live, in a new environment which is smart, clean including circular economy, no waste, and third, inclusive, I mean, without ghettos.
So
because
very
we know what
clear, visible
this is
benefits.
physical,
Hans?
huh?
People might think that Mrs. Rodrigues and I have been planning this long in advance, but we know each other from only this morning. And not even before breakfast. But I would like to add a little to what my Irish colleague said. That the money you put into a program like Juncker is insignificant. And I would like to relate that to what Emma talked about this morning, and that is that the levels of taxation in Europe are the highest. Which means that overall, a lot of public money is put in other directions than in the direction of, let's say, competitiveness. For the Netherlands, if you take the budget of the Netherlands government and you make a division between all expenditures which are, let's say, for social expenditure, healthcare and that sort of things, they add up to 65% of the total budget. If you get all the expenditures which are for competitiveness, also the whole budget for education, if you would also say that's for competitiveness, they add up to 18%, and it has been decreasing 10 percentage points in 10 years' time. And I agree completely with you that if we, I'm not telling you that it should be the other way around, but if we want a competitive economy which is growing and which provides jobs for the people, then we have to take a little bit a different approach. I would very much like to support the idea of my...
Can I just come to one other point before we draw some conclusion? And that was the third to perform that the Prime Minister highlighted, comply to perform. He talked about reforming to perform, complying to reform, innovating to reform. Most today is implementation. We started with Emma this morning. You need, you have the words. We may be big on the big things on it. For each of you, I think part of the problem here is often that politicians will tell you, well, it's not very sexy implementing stuff. What's sexy, what is interesting and challenging is coming up with new ideas. And you've had some very concrete new ideas. How do we address this implementation gap? Do you have any suggestions, not just at EU level, because we've heard 1/5 of the recommendations made to member states they're not delivering on, and that's one of the big concerns for members of Business Europe who say, we're identifying the right recommendations, but they're not doing them. How do we bridge that delivery gap? Any thoughts on that before we try and draw some conclusions? Danny.
I think communication is actually one of the features. One of the aspects about regulation is we'll have a problem. We've got a migration problem at the moment, or we might have a water problem. And by the time it goes through the legislative process, it could be 3, 4, 5 years when the regulation comes back to deal with the problem which the citizens wanted dealt with, and then they just see this regulation. We need to bring the story back to say this regulation has a purpose. And the purpose is very often never communicated when regulations come down the line. And so I think the communication of why regulation actually makes our lives better. Also, regulation can make us competitive. One of the big successes of the Irish economy has been the medical devices sector. Strong regulation and strong compliance delivered every time, first time, right time, means that you become a world beater. And so Europe has lots of evidence of where regulation gives us competitive advantage, yet we're very poor at actually telling the businesses and the citizens why those regulations were put there in the first instance and why it's a delivery. It's not actually a failure of Europe.
But that might address the Prime Minister's point about when he said entrepreneurs don't see Europe as the place to be. They associate it simply with regulation and red tape. But it won't actually, will it help to address the political delivery question, if you like, that member states do what they say they will do or sign up to do?
Small ones do what they're told. The problem with Europe is the perception that big countries don't.
So an unfairness perception, which is, yeah. Diogo, in terms of this implementation and turning from words to deeds.
Two basic suggestions, coming from business, of course. First, when we have a plan and after some time it's not working, it does not mean the plan is wrong, so let's not start a new plan, which sometimes at certain levels, including the European level, happens. Let's see what is not working with the current plan and let's fight and strive to make it work. First key suggestion. Then I may say that I have worked at different levels, both in France, in Portugal, and at the European level with different regulators in general. Those who have had a real-life experience, sorry for the comment, before, are much better regulators. So I would have a simple, basic proposal. You cannot be a regulator at large if you have not had 5 years real-life experience.
Can you be a politician? Can you be elected to public office at all?
After 5 years of...
After 5 years, but you'd like a 5-year rule.
A 5-year rule. Simple rule.
Very, very
pragmatic.
Hans, from words to deeds, how do we do it?
Well, it's a very difficult question. But I have the idea that I'm now saying something which is by far not as interesting and important as our Smart Border project. I've said it 5 times now.
We've got the message.
Yeah, okay. But I have sometimes the feeling that we have too many commissioners in place on too many fields of action. I think we should have more focus. Have 4 or 5 or 6 fields and say, in those fields we are active and we have a commissioner for it, and maybe then we have a period with no Dutch commissioner, which would be very sad for the European Union, but we have to live with that. So I would like to have a little bit more focus on things.
Okay, so although the Commission has tried to focus more, you still think there's just too many of them, they all need a job, and we need to...
And they all come up with that, because they're all good people, so they all want to have their own thing, and I think it's too much. And it doesn't communicate to the people, because the people, they don't have a clue who is commissioner of what, so it doesn't give any feeling, any connection with what's happening in Brussels. I think that's not good.
And João, Marcus mentioned earlier, and I mentioned the Lisbon Agenda, and we were going to be the world's most competitive, knowledge-based economy in the world. Yeah, let's not remind ourselves, why are we struggling so much? You had the words, you had the action plan. Why are we still struggling so much to turn them into deeds? What's the answer to unlock that?
Well, I will take Diogo's advice, because I completely agree with him. So the plan was good, and from my viewpoint it remains good, and now it's translated into something called Europe 2020 strategy. But what we really need is to have a very frank and open discussion why this is not being implemented, why we should tackle this and this is an obstacle. And sometimes this is missing. But I must tell you that today in this conference, I could find really the conditions to have this in-depth discussion. And I can tell you now from the European Parliament side that indeed parliamentarians, this is the second Diogo's advice, parliamentarians, sometimes they do have this other professional experience, sometimes they don't. But there is something for sure, is that if you want to have better lawmaking in Europe, we need to change the method we use to define law. And the method should start by listening to people who do have the experience, to involve them. This is one thing. And the other thing, because I was also to come back to our idea of the smart border, this is a situation where I can tell you, this is not very politically correct, but I will tell you. This is urgent project. Not only to save Schengen, is to keep the move of the European integration in the good sense of the move. And I'm not sure if the political system will deliver with the speed we need to deliver. That's why I think this time we should use another method, is to have powerful voices coming from the civil society saying, look, we need this and we can deliver this. And these voices, they will be supported by European citizens, because everybody sees this is important. And like that, the political system will be under pressure to deliver in quicker pace.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have a chat in a moment if she returns with the Business Europe President, Emma Marcegaglia. But before I do that, I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask her later. Prime Minister Rutte talked earlier about we will achieve our goals step by step. We can't do it all at once. But he did say, I want to hear from you. Tell us what to do. So if you were to tell him one thing to do to make sure that, as you've defined them, we are big on the big things, that we are small on the small ones, and that we really do deliver and can be successful, what for each of you would you do as a key next step? Not a priority. I mean, you've talked about your smart borders, I think, as your big project, but going out of here, what would you do? What would be the very first thing you'd do? Danny first.
I would change the fiscal rules to identify investment as not counting as part of the very correct rules so we don't get into trouble. But by its very nature, investment is to increase the capacity of the bottom line, so it actually delivers you the ratios you require. And the very last one would be, from a very Ireland-centric one, is the idea of connecting up Ireland to Britain by a tunnel. There's a demonstrable statement of intent to connect the member states together who are already existent before we go beyond our borders.
Well, you say the member states are already in existence. That presupposes a certain outcome on June the 23rd.
Didn't say where the tunnel will go to.
Would you build it anyway, Brexit or no Brexit?
Build it anyway.
Build it anyway. Diogo, your key next step.
maybe I would listen, but in a very structured way. So, as we hear in Business Europe, for things related to business, I would conduct a very thorough survey among hundreds or thousands of managers across Europe, would do a quantitative analysis of that, with quite a team, would do also some qualitative research, would get lots of findings of what really is preventing things from happening, and would then, most important, dare acting upon the conclusions. Because studies, there's lots of them as well. But to listen is to understand, think, integrate, decide, act. So I would listen and dare act upon what I would listen.
Thank you very much, Hans.
I think I would start a campaign for the beauty of Europe. Its variety, culturally, economically. We are the best continent in the world. I think I would start with that.
Thank you.
And from there on, build in other directions.
Very interesting, because really you've taken us back to where we started this morning, when we talked about why do we tend to talk ourselves down? Maybe that we are causing the problem by doing that. So begin to redress that image problem that we have with ourselves.
We have all the reasons to be pessimistic, but we have also many reasons to be glad that we live in Europe, and there are so many good and beautiful things.
Thank you, Maria João. Can you keep that upbeat note as we end?
Now, in the same line, because I also believe that Europe is a beautiful idea, my next step will be to give voice to young people in Europe, because young people have a tremendous feeling how we can achieve success in Europe by being Europeans. For them, this is natural. So we cannot go backwards in this idea, and I will start by giving voice to young people.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed, and thank you for finishing so positively. It is good. I started the day asking people how they, amid all the doom and gloom, did they see opportunities. It is very good that we finish on an upbeat note.